Tyler Matthews crouched on his hands and knees in the middle of Riverside High's cafeteria, crawling under lunch tables while 300 students watched and laughed. Connor Blake stood over him, arms crossed, a cruel smile spreading across his face as he watched the new kid scramble around on the floor like a dog, searching for scraps. What Connor didn't know was that Tyler had never lost a wrestling match in his life, and this humiliation was about to become the biggest mistake Connor Blake would ever make. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The October rain drummed against the windows of Riverside High School as Tyler Matthews pulled his worn backpack higher on his shoulders and walked through the front doors for the first time. At 16, Tyler had the kind of build that made people look right through him, slight and wiry with clothes that hung loose on his frame. His dark hair fell across his forehead in a way that seemed designed to hide behind, and his green eyes had developed the habit of looking down at his shoes rather than meeting anyone's gaze directly. To anyone watching, Tyler Matthews appeared to be exactly what Millfield, Oregon didn't need another one of: a quiet, unremarkable kid who would blend into the background and disappear entirely by graduation. What made Tyler's appearance even more deceiving was his deliberately chosen wardrobe. His jeans were a size too big, his flannel shirt hung loose around his torso, and his sneakers were the kind of generic brand that screamed, "Trying not to be noticed." Everything about Tyler's presentation was carefully calculated to project weakness and invisibility. He had learned over the past few months that sometimes the best way to avoid conflict was to make yourself seem like you weren't worth the trouble. The hallways of Riverside High stretched before him like a gauntlet he'd have to navigate daily. Students clustered around lockers in their established social groups, their conversations creating a constant buzz of teenage drama and weekend plans. Tyler had been through this routine before, more times than he cared to remember. Though this move to Millfield was supposed to be different. This time his father had promised they were putting down roots. This time Tyler was supposed to try to fit in, make friends, be a normal teenager instead of the focused, driven competitor he'd been for most of his life. As Tyler made his way toward the main office to collect his schedule, he passed the trophy case that dominated the central hallway. Behind the glass, golden figures frozen in athletic poses told the story of Riverside High's sporting glory. Football trophies took up most of the space, gleaming reminders of state championships and conference titles that stretched back decades. Basketball awards filled another section, and scattered throughout were smaller trophies for track, baseball, and other sports that mattered less in this small Oregon town where Friday night football games were the social event of the week. What Tyler noticed immediately was the conspicuous absence of wrestling trophies. There was a single small shelf in the corner with 3 dusty awards, all of them more than 5 years old. It was clear that wrestling, if it existed at all at Riverside High, was an afterthought. For Tyler, this absence was both disappointing and oddly comforting. Disappointing because wrestling had been his life's passion since he was 8 years old, but comforting because it meant no one here would expect anything from him. No one would know that those 3 small, forgotten trophies represented more success than Tyler had achieved at his previous school, where he'd won 3 consecutive state championships and been recruited by Division I universities before. His family's sudden move to Millfield. The bell rang for first period, and Tyler found himself swept along in the river of students flowing toward their classrooms. His first class was Advanced Mathematics with Mrs. Peterson, and Tyler slipped into a seat near the back corner, hoping to observe the social dynamics without drawing attention to himself. The classroom filled with the usual mix of students that Tyler had learned to categorize over his years of changing schools: the obviously popular kids who sat together and spoke in the kind of casual confidence that came from never having to worry about fitting in. The academic achievers who positioned themselves in the front row with color-coded notebooks already open, and the various middle-tier students who comprised the majority of any high school population. It was during this first period that Tyler got his initial glimpse of Connor Blake. Connor entered the classroom 3 minutes after the bell, not hurrying, not apologizing, simply walking in with the kind of casual authority that suggested rules were more like suggestions where he was concerned. Connor was everything Tyler was not. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of natural athleticism that was immediately obvious even when he was just walking to his desk. His blonde hair was perfectly styled. His clothes fit him like they'd been tailored specifically for his frame, and most tellingly, other students automatically shifted their attention to him the moment he entered the room. Mrs. Peterson barely looked up from her lesson plan when Connor took his seat. This told Tyler everything he needed to know about the power dynamics at Riverside High. Connor Blake was untouchable, the kind of student who could bend rules without consequence because his value to the school extended far beyond the classroom. As Tyler would learn over the following days, Connor was the captain of the football team that had won the state championship the previous year, the son of a former NFL player who had become a local legend, and the kind of natural leader that teachers and administrators preferred to accommodate rather than challenge. During that first math class, Tyler kept his head down and his mouth shut, a strategy that had served him well in previous schools. He completed the assigned problems quickly and accurately, but made no effort to participate in class discussion or draw attention to his academic abilities. This was part of Tyler's deliberate strategy of mediocrity, a conscious decision to perform just well enough to avoid notice while hiding both his intellectual capabilities and his athletic background. The rest of Tyler's first day proceeded without incident, which was exactly how he preferred it. He navigated the hallways like a ghost, attending classes, taking notes, eating lunch alone at a corner table while reading a paperback novel he'd brought from home. By the time the final bell rang, Tyler felt confident that he'd successfully established himself as exactly what he wanted to be: forgettable. It was on his second day at Riverside High that Tyler's carefully constructed invisibility began to crack. He was walking to his locker after third period when he accidentally bumped into Ryan Torres, one of Connor Blake's closest friends and a starting guard on the basketball team. The collision was minor, barely worth acknowledging under normal circumstances, but Ryan's reaction was immediate and disproportionate. "Watch where you're going, fresh meat," Ryan said, his voice loud enough to draw attention from nearby students. Ryan was tall and lean, with the kind of quick reflexes that made him dangerous on the basketball court, but he also had the predatory instincts that came from years of being part of Connor Blake's inner circle. Tyler immediately apologized, his voice quiet and deferential in the way he'd learned was most likely to diffuse tension. "Sorry, didn't see you there." "Didn't see me?" Ryan's eyebrows shot up in exaggerated disbelief. "How do you not see someone right in front of you? Are you blind or just stupid?" The hallway around them had grown quieter as other students sensed the potential for drama. Tyler could feel eyes on him, that familiar sensation of being evaluated and judged that he'd experienced at every new school. This was always the moment of truth, the instant when a new student's place in the social hierarchy was established. Tyler made the conscious decision to choose submission over confrontation. "Just wasn't paying attention," Tyler said, his voice even quieter than before. "My fault entirely." Ryan studied Tyler for a long moment, taking in his oversized clothes, his downcast eyes, his obvious discomfort with being the center of attention. Tyler could practically see Ryan's assessment taking place. New kid, weak, afraid, perfect target. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It was a calculation Tyler had seen before, and he accepted it as the price of maintaining his cover. "Better start paying attention," Ryan said finally, his voice carrying the kind of casual menace that suggested this was friendly advice rather than a threat. "Accidents happen to people who don't watch where they're going." Tyler nodded quickly and hurried away, but he could feel Ryan's eyes following him down the hallway. Word of this encounter would reach Connor Blake within the hour, Tyler knew, and his name would be added to the mental list of students who could be pushed around without consequence. It was exactly what Tyler had expected, and exactly what he'd been trying to avoid. But some outcomes were inevitable regardless of how carefully you planned. The third day at Riverside High was when Tyler first experienced Connor Blake's direct attention. Tyler was sitting in the cafeteria, eating his lunch alone while reading, when Connor's shadow fell across his table. Tyler looked up to find Connor standing there with Marcus Webb, his constant companion, who seemed to exist primarily to laugh at Connor's jokes and provide an audience for his dominance displays. "You're the new kid, right?" Connor asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Up close, Connor was even more physically imposing than he'd appeared from across the classroom. He had the kind of natural charisma that drew people to him, combined with the absolute confidence that came from never having been seriously challenged. "Tyler Matthews," Tyler replied, closing his book and looking up at Connor with what he hoped was respectful attention. "I'm Connor Blake," Connor said, as if his identity required introduction. "Football team captain, probably heard of me already. This is Marcus." Marcus grinned and nodded, clearly thrilled to be part of whatever was about to happen. Tyler had encountered Marcus's type before, the devoted follower who gained status through association with power, always eager to prove his loyalty through enthusiastic participation in whatever cruelty his leader devised. "Nice to meet you," Tyler said, his voice steady despite the growing certainty that this conversation was heading somewhere unpleasant. Connor looked down at Tyler's book, a battered paperback copy of a science fiction novel that Tyler had read multiple times. "Light reading?" Connor asked, picking up the book without permission and flipping through it dismissively. "Pretty advanced stuff for someone who bumps into people because he's not paying attention." The reference to his encounter with Ryan told Tyler that his assessment had been correct. Word of every interaction traveled quickly through Connor's network, and Tyler's behavior was being monitored and evaluated. Connor was gathering information, testing boundaries, establishing the parameters of their relationship. "Just something to pass the time," Tyler said, reaching out to take his book back. Connor held the book away from Tyler's outstretched hand, a casual exercise of power that was small enough to seem playful, but significant enough to establish control. "You know what I think, Tyler Matthews? I think you're trying too hard to be invisible. New kids usually want to make friends, join clubs, try out for teams. But you're sitting here alone, reading books, keeping your head down like you're afraid of something." Tyler's pulse quickened slightly, but he kept his expression neutral. Connor was more perceptive than Tyler had given him credit for, and that made him significantly more dangerous. "Just trying to figure out the place, you know? Get settled in." "Getting settled in means meeting people," Connor said, finally returning Tyler's book. "Lucky for you, you've met me. And since I basically run this place, I'm going to help you understand how things work around here." Connor sat down across from Tyler without being invited, Marcus immediately taking the seat next to him. This was clearly a planned demonstration, Tyler realized, performed for the benefit of the dozen or so students within earshot who were pretending not to listen while hanging on every word. "See, Tyler, Riverside High has a pretty simple social structure," Connor continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone explaining basic concepts to a child. There are people who matter, people who don't matter, and people who haven't figured out which category they belong in yet. Right now, you're in that third group, which means you have a choice to make. Tyler said nothing, sensing that Connor preferred an audience to a conversation partner. The choice is this, Connor said, leaning forward slightly. You can recognize that some people here have earned their position through talent, hard work, and natural leadership. You can show proper respect for that hierarchy and find your place within it. Or you can pretend that you're somehow special, somehow different, somehow deserving of treatment you haven't earned. Marcus nodded along enthusiastically, clearly having heard this speech before. Most new kids figure it out pretty quick, he added helpfully. Connor smiled at Marcus's contribution, then turned his attention back to Tyler. The thing is, Tyler, I can tell you're a smart guy, smart enough to read complicated books, smart enough to stay out of trouble, smart enough to understand what I'm telling you right now, so I'm confident you're going to make the right choice. Tyler met Connor's gaze directly for the first time, a moment of eye contact that lasted just long enough to show he understood the implications without being long enough to constitute a challenge. I just want to get through school without any problems, Tyler said finally. Exactly, Connor said, slapping the table with satisfaction. That's exactly the right attitude. No problems, no drama, no confusion about how things work. I think we're going to get along just fine, Tyler Matthews. Connor stood up, Marcus immediately following suit. Welcome to Riverside High, Connor said, his tone now friendly and magnanimous. I think you're going to fit in perfectly. As Connor and Marcus walked away, Tyler reopened his book and tried to focus on reading, but his mind was racing. Connor Blake was smart, charismatic, and absolutely ruthless beneath his friendly exterior. Worse, he was the kind of bully who understood that the most effective oppression came disguised as guidance, that the most lasting humiliation was the kind that made victims complicit in their own degradation. Tyler had just been given his marching orders, and they were clear: submit completely or face escalating consequences. Tyler's second week at Riverside High began with an unexpected complication. The school was buzzing with excitement about homecoming. Week and everywhere Tyler looked, there were posters advertising the annual Tri-County Wrestling Championship that would be held in the school gymnasium the Saturday after the homecoming dance. For most students, the wrestling tournament was a minor sideshow to the main events of homecoming court elections and football game preparations. But for Tyler, those posters might as well have been spotlights illuminating everything he was trying to hide. The gymnasium where Tyler ate lunch on rainy days was being transformed into a wrestling venue, with portable bleachers being assembled and regulation mats being rolled out across the basketball court. Tyler found himself drawn to watch the setup, processed during his free periods, careful to maintain his usual distance and disinterested demeanor while internally cataloging every detail. The mats were regulation size and properly maintained. The lighting was adequate for competition, and the venue itself was large enough to accommodate the kind of crowd that serious wrestling tournaments attracted. What Tyler found most interesting was overhearing conversations between Coach Anderson and the maintenance staff about the tournament's significance. Apparently, college scouts from 3 different universities would be attending, looking for potential recruits among the competing wrestlers. The winner of each weight class would receive not just a trophy, but also serious consideration for wrestling scholarships. For Tyler, who had been recruited by Division I programs before his family's move to Oregon, this information was both tantalizing and dangerous. The tournament represented exactly the kind of opportunity he'd given up when his family relocated, but participating would mean abandoning the careful anonymity he'd constructed at Riverside High. Tyler's internal conflict about the wrestling tournament was complicated by his growing understanding of how thoroughly Connor Blake dominated the school's social landscape. During his second week, Tyler witnessed Connor's influence extending far beyond the football team and into every aspect of student life. Teachers deferred to Connor's schedule when planning assignments. Administrators consulted with him about school policy changes, and even students who weren't part of his immediate circle sought his approval for their social activities. The scope of Connor's power became clear during a particularly uncomfortable encounter in Tyler's advanced English class. Mrs. Sullivan had assigned a group project analyzing themes in contemporary literature, and Tyler found himself paired with Emma Rodriguez, a quiet but observant junior who worked on the school newspaper. Emma was exactly the kind of student Tyler had hoped to avoid: intelligent, curious, and possessing the journalist's instinct for uncovering hidden stories. Emma approached Tyler after class with a friendly smile and a notebook already filled with ideas for their project. "I was thinking we could focus on the outsider protagonist theme," she said, falling into step beside Tyler as they walked toward the hallway. "You know, characters who don't fit into their environments and how they navigate social hierarchies." Tyler felt a chill of recognition at Emma's choice of topic, wondering if she'd selected it randomly or if she'd already begun to sense something unusual about him. "That's fine with me," he replied carefully. "Whatever you think would work best." Emma studied Tyler's face with the kind of direct attention that made him uncomfortable. She had dark eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the confident bearing of someone who'd learned to trust her own observations over popular opinion. "You know, I've been watching how you move through this place," she said, her voice low enough that other students couldn't overhear. "You're very careful about staying invisible, but invisible is different from weak." Before Tyler could respond to Emma's unsettling observation, Connor Blake appeared beside them, as if summoned by some sixth sense for detecting potentially problematic conversations. Connor's arrival was so perfectly timed that Tyler suspected he'd been monitoring their interaction from across the hallway. "Emma Rodriguez," Connor said with his trademark smile, the one that managed to be charming and threatening simultaneously. "I hope you're not bothering our new student here. Tyler's still getting used to how things work at Riverside High." Emma's expression didn't change, but Tyler caught the subtle tightening around her eyes that suggested she understood exactly what Connor was really saying. "Just discussing our English project, Connor. Nothing that concerns you." Connor's smile widened, and Tyler recognized the expression from his encounter in the cafeteria. Connor enjoyed being challenged just enough to justify his response, and Emma had just provided him with the opening he wanted. "Everything that happens in this school concerns me, Emma," Connor said, his tone remaining friendly while his words carried unmistakable authority. "Especially when it involves helping new students understand their place. You wouldn't want Tyler to get confused about how things work around here, would you?" Tyler watched this exchange with growing dread, recognizing that Emma's association with him had just made her a target. Connor's message was clear: students who befriended Tyler without Connor's approval would face consequences. It was a sophisticated form of social control that isolated potential allies while reinforcing Connor's position as the gatekeeper of all relationships at Riverside High. Emma, however, proved to be made of sterner stuff than Connor had anticipated. "I think Tyler is perfectly capable of making his own decisions about his friendships," she said, her voice steady despite the obvious pressure she was under. "Thanks for your concern, though." Connor's expression shifted slightly, surprise flickering across his features before being replaced by something colder. "You know, Emma, I've always admired your independence, but independence only works when you're strong enough to handle the consequences. Make sure you know what you're getting yourself into." With that warning delivered, Connor walked away. but not before giving Tyler a look that conveyed clear expectations. Tyler was supposed to distance himself from Emma, to reject her friendship in favor of maintaining his position in Connor's carefully constructed hierarchy. The fact that Connor felt the need to intervene so quickly told Tyler everything he needed to know about how closely his behavior was being monitored. Emma waited until Connor was out of earshot before speaking again. "Well, that was enlightening," she said, adjusting her glasses with fingers that trembled slightly despite her brave front. "I guess I know what kind of project partner you're going to be." Tyler felt the familiar weight of choosing between self-preservation and doing what was right. Emma had just put herself at risk by defending him, and Connor's threat had been real. The safe choice would be to apologize to Emma, explain that he couldn't afford to make enemies so early in his time at Riverside High, and find a way to complete their project with minimal interaction. Instead, Tyler surprised himself by saying, "I'm sorry you got pulled into that. Connor seems to think he needs to manage everyone's relationships." Emma looked at Tyler with renewed interest, clearly not having expected him to acknowledge what had just happened. "So, you do notice what's going on around here?" "I was beginning to wonder if you were genuinely oblivious or just very good at pretending." Tyler felt his carefully constructed facade beginning to crack under Emma's perceptive questioning. "I notice plenty," he said quietly. "I just prefer to avoid unnecessary complications." "And yet you just chose to continue talking to me instead of walking away," Emma pointed out, "which suggests that maybe you're not as committed to avoiding complications as you claim." Tyler didn't have a good answer for that observation, mainly because Emma was right. Something about her willingness to stand up to Connor had triggered a response in Tyler that bypassed his usual caution. For the first time since arriving at Riverside High, he found himself genuinely liking another student. Their conversation was interrupted by the warning bell for next period, but Emma handed Tyler a piece of paper with her phone number written on it. "Text me tonight about the project," she said. "I have some ideas I think you'll find interesting." As Tyler walked to his next class, he realized that Emma's entry into his life represented a fundamental shift in his situation at Riverside High. Connor would interpret Tyler's continued association with Emma as defiance, which meant the careful balance Tyler had maintained during his first week was about to be disrupted. The smart thing would be to text Emma a polite message explaining that he couldn't work with her on the project, to find an excuse to change partners before Connor decided to escalate his intervention. But Tyler found himself looking forward to Emma's ideas for their project, curious about what she'd observed about him, and impressed by her courage in facing down Connor's implicit threats. For the first time since arriving in Millfield, Tyler felt like he might have found someone worth the risk of friendship. Tyler's third week at Riverside High marked the beginning of what he would later recognize as Connor's systematic campaign to establish complete dominance over him. The campaign began subtly, with small incidents that could be dismissed as coincidence or misunderstanding, but quickly escalated into a pattern of deliberate harassment designed to isolate Tyler from his classmates and reinforce his position at the bottom of the school's social hierarchy. The first incident occurred on Monday morning when Tyler arrived at his locker to find it had been filled with crumpled newspaper and empty food containers. The mess wasn't destructive enough to constitute serious vandalism, but it was clearly deliberate and required Tyler to spend his entire passing period cleaning out the debris while other students watched and whispered. No one offered to help, and Tyler noticed that several students who had previously been neutral toward him now actively avoided eye contact. Connor appeared just as Tyler was throwing away the last of the trash, his timing so perfect that Tyler knew the locker incident had been orchestrated specifically to create this moment. "That's weird," Connor said, his voice carrying just enough concern to sound sincere to anyone overhearing. "Someone really messed with your stuff. You have any idea who might have done something like that?" Tyler met Connor's eyes and saw the satisfaction there, the pleasure Connor took in forcing Tyler to acknowledge what had happened while pretending to be helpful. "No idea," Tyler replied, his voice flat. "Probably just a prank." "Probably," Connor agreed, his smile widening slightly. "You know, Tyler, pranks like this usually happen to people who haven't figured out how to fit in properly. Maybe you should think about what kind of message you're sending with your behavior." The second incident came on Wednesday during lunch. Tyler had been sitting with Emma working on their English project and enjoying what felt like his first normal teenage conversation since arriving at Riverside High. Emma was intelligent and funny, with observations about their classmates that were both insightful and entertaining. For 45 minutes, Tyler had almost forgotten about Connor Blake and the careful balance he was supposed to maintain. That illusion was shattered when Ryan Torres approached their table with a lunch tray full of food. Ryan's approach seemed casual, just another student navigating the crowded cafeteria until he accidentally tripped while walking past Tyler's chair. The contents of Ryan's tray spilled across Tyler and Emma's table, covering their project. Materials in a mixture of spaghetti sauce, milk, and chocolate pudding. "Oh man, I'm so sorry," Ryan said, his apology sounding perfectly sincere to anyone who hadn't seen the slight smile that crossed his face just before he tripped. "I totally didn't see you there. Let me help clean this up." Emma stared at the ruined papers with obvious dismay, hours of careful research now soaked in cafeteria food. "These were our only copies," she said quietly, more to herself than to Ryan. "That really sucks," Ryan replied, making a show of helping to clean up while actually making the mess worse. "Maybe next time you guys should work in the library instead of taking up cafeteria space. Accidents happen when people don't pay attention to traffic flow." Tyler felt something shift inside him as he watched Emma carefully gathering the soggy remains of their project. The papers were completely ruined, representing hours of work that would need to be redone. But more importantly, Emma was being punished for her association with him. Connor's message was becoming clearer with each incident. Anyone who chose to befriend Tyler would face consequences until they learned to avoid him entirely. "We can redo the research," Tyler said quietly after Ryan had walked away, still maintaining his helpful facade. Emma looked at Tyler with a mixture of frustration and growing understanding. "This wasn't an accident, was it?" she asked, her journalist's instincts finally putting the pieces together. Tyler hesitated, knowing that confirming Emma's suspicions would make her a more deliberate target, while denying them would insult her intelligence. "I think some people don't like the idea of us working together," he said finally. Emma studied Tyler's face for a long moment, clearly recognizing that there was more to the situation than he was willing to explain. "Why?" she asked simply. Tyler didn't have a good answer for that question, at least not one he could share, without revealing the careful game he'd been playing since his arrival at Riverside High. "I'm not sure," he said, which was simultaneously true and completely inadequate. The third incident escalated beyond property damage and spilled food into something more personal and humiliating. Tyler was walking to his car after school on Friday when Connor and Marcus appeared beside him in the parking lot. Connor's approach was friendly and casual, the kind of encounter that would appear completely normal to anyone observing from a distance. "Tyler, buddy," Connor said, falling into step beside him, "I've been meaning to talk to you about something important." Tyler's pulse quickened, but he maintained his usual quiet demeanor. "What's that?" "I've been hearing some concerning things about your attitude lately," Connor said, his tone suggesting disappointment rather than anger. "People are telling me that you're not really embracing the Riverside High community spirit." that you're keeping to yourself, not participating in school activities, not showing proper respect for the traditions that make this place special. Marcus nodded along enthusiastically, clearly having heard this speech before. "It's like you, who think you're too good for the rest of us," he added helpfully. Tyler recognized this as another test, another opportunity for Connor to gauge how much resistance Tyler was willing to offer before submitting completely. "I'm just trying to focus on my schoolwork," Tyler said carefully. "See, that's exactly what I'm talking about," Connor said, stopping suddenly and turning to face Tyler directly. "You think schoolwork is more important than learning how to be part of a community. You think sitting alone reading books makes you better than people who understand the value of teamwork and social contribution." They had reached Tyler's car, a 10-year-old Honda that his father had bought specifically because it was unremarkable and unlikely to attract attention. Connor leaned against the driver's side door, casually blocking Tyler's access while making the gesture appear friendly and conversational. "The thing is, Tyler, I'm starting to think you need a more hands-on education about how things work around here," Connor continued. "Book learning is fine, but some lessons can only be taught through direct experience." Tyler felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with recognizing a threat, but he also felt something else, the first stirrings of genuine anger. Connor's campaign of harassment had been building systematically, each incident designed to be deniable while contributing to a pattern of deliberate intimidation. Tyler had accepted the harassment as the price of maintaining his cover, but Connor's casual arrogance was beginning to trigger responses that Tyler had spent months learning to suppress. "I'm not looking for any trouble," Tyler said, his voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. "I know you're not," Connor replied, his smile widening as if Tyler had just proved his point. "That's what makes this so educational. Sometimes trouble finds people who aren't prepared for it, people who haven't learned to protect themselves by understanding their place in the natural order." Connor stepped away from Tyler's car door, finally allowing him access, but not before delivering his final message. "I want you to think about what we've discussed today, Tyler. Think about what kind of student you want to be, what kind of reputation you want to have. Because next week, I'm going to start paying much closer attention to your progress." As Connor and Marcus walked away, Tyler sat in his car for several minutes before starting the engine. Connor's threats were becoming less subtle and more direct, which meant the situation was approaching a point where Tyler would have to choose between maintaining his cover and defending himself. The smart choice was obvious: submit completely to Connor's authority, accept whatever humiliation was necessary to avoid escalation, and count on graduation to eventually free him from this environment. But Tyler found himself thinking about Emma's ruined project, about the fear in her eyes when she realized that her friendship with him had made her a target. He thought about his father's advice about choosing battles wisely, but also about his father's insistence that some battles chose you regardless of your preferences. Most of all, Tyler thought about the wrestling tournament posters that seemed to mock him from every hallway, advertising an opportunity that represented everything he'd given up to maintain his carefully constructed anonymity. Tyler's fourth week at Riverside High began with an escalation that shattered any pretense that Connor's harassment was random or impersonal. The incident occurred on Monday morning in Tyler's first period advanced mathematics class, where Tyler had maintained his strategy of competent but unremarkable performance. Mrs. Peterson had returned their recent test results, and Tyler had deliberately answered several questions incorrectly to ensure his score remained in the solid B range that attracted no special attention. Connor, who sat 3 rows away, had apparently received a grade that displeased him significantly. Tyler caught Connor glancing repeatedly in his direction during the class, a predatory attention that made Tyler increasingly uncomfortable. When the bell rang, Connor lingered near Tyler's desk while other students filed out of the classroom. "Hey, Tyler," Connor said, his voice carrying the familiar tone of false friendliness that Tyler had learned to dread. "I noticed you did pretty well on that test. Mrs. Peterson was saying nice things about your work." Tyler felt a chill of recognition. He had been too careful to stand out academically, but apparently not careful enough to avoid Connor's notice entirely. "Just tried my best," Tyler replied, gathering his materials quickly in hopes of avoiding an extended conversation. "See, that's interesting," Connor continued, moving to block Tyler's path to the door. "Because I've been watching your work in this class, and I'm starting to think you're a lot smarter than you pretend to be, like maybe you're deliberately hiding how smart you really are." Tyler's pulse quickened as he realized that Connor had been conducting a more sophisticated analysis of his behavior than Tyler had anticipated. Connor wasn't just a simple bully looking for easy targets. He was genuinely intelligent and had been systematically studying Tyler's patterns of behavior to identify inconsistencies. "I don't know what you mean," Tyler said, which was technically true, even though he understood exactly what Connor was implying. "I think you do," Connor replied, his smile taking on a sharper edge. "I think you're playing some kind of game. Tyler Matthews, pretending to be something you're not, trying to fly under the radar for reasons I haven't figured out yet. But here's the thing about games. They're only fun when everyone knows they're playing." Mrs. Peterson had left the classroom, and Tyler realized that Connor had deliberately timed this conversation to occur when they would be alone. Connor's positioning near the door wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate demonstration of control that would force Tyler to either submit to interrogation or physically push past Connor to leave. "I'm not playing any games," Tyler said, his voice remaining steady despite his growing alarm at how perceptive Connor was proving to be. "Maybe not," Connor conceded, "but you're definitely not being honest about who you really are. And that bothers me, Tyler. It bothers me because dishonesty disrupts the natural order that keeps this place running smoothly." Connor stepped closer, close enough that Tyler could smell his cologne and see the calculation in his blue eyes. "So here's what's going to happen," Connor continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow seemed more threatening than shouting. Would have been. "You're going to start being more truthful about your capabilities. You're going to stop pretending to be less than you are, because pretending makes people wonder what else you might be hiding." Tyler felt trapped between competing dangers. Revealing his true academic abilities would attract the kind of attention he'd been trying to avoid, but continuing to hide them would only increase Connor's suspicions about what else Tyler might be concealing. Either choice seemed likely to lead Connor closer to discovering Tyler's wrestling background. "I really don't know what you want from me," Tyler said, which was perhaps the most honest thing he'd said to Connor since arriving at Riverside High. Connor studied Tyler's face for a long moment, clearly trying to determine whether Tyler's confusion was genuine or performed. "What I want," Connor said finally, "is for you to understand that this conversation is a kindness. I'm giving you the opportunity to be honest with me voluntarily, which is much better than having to discover your secrets through other methods." The threat was clear. Connor would escalate his investigation of Tyler's background if Tyler didn't provide information willingly. Tyler realized that his strategy of careful mediocrity had actually made him more suspicious rather than less, and that Connor's intelligence made him far more dangerous than a typical school bully. "I'll think about what you've said," Tyler replied, which was the closest he could come to agreeing without actually admitting anything. Connor stepped aside, finally allowing Tyler to reach the door. "I hope you will," Connor said, "because thinking time is limited, Tyler. I'm not a patient person when it comes to getting answers." As Tyler left the classroom, he realized that his situation at Riverside High had fundamentally changed. Connor was no longer content with simple dominance. He was actively investigating Tyler's background and would continue to escalate until he discovered whatever secrets Tyler was hiding. The careful balance Tyler had maintained for 4 weeks was collapsing, and he would soon be forced to choose between revealing his true capabilities and facing Connor's increasingly sophisticated harassment. The week that followed Connor's interrogation in the mathematics classroom marked the beginning of what Tyler would later recognize as a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to break down his resistance through systematic humiliation. Connor's approach was methodical and intelligent, employing psychological pressure rather than physical confrontation to force Tyler toward a breaking point where he would either submit completely or reveal whatever he was hiding. The campaign began with social isolation. Students who had previously been neutral toward Tyler now actively avoided him, warned off by whispered conversations with Connor's lieutenants. Emma remained loyal, but Tyler noticed that she was being subjected to her own forms of harassment. Her locker was repeatedly jammed, her belongings were mysteriously misplaced, and she was excluded from group activities she had previously been invited to join. Tyler felt responsible for Emma's suffering, recognizing that her association with him had made her a target for Connor's systematic retaliation. During their English class on Wednesday, Tyler attempted to suggest that they should work separately on their project to protect Emma from further harassment. "Absolutely not," Emma said firmly when Tyler made his carefully worded suggestion. "I'm not going to let Connor Blake dictate who I can be friends with." "It's not about letting him dictate anything," Tyler replied, keeping his voice low to avoid attracting attention from their classmates. "It's about being practical. He's making things difficult for you because of me." Emma studied Tyler with the direct gaze that made him uncomfortable, as if she could see through his careful explanations to the calculations underneath. "Why do you think Connor is so interested in controlling you specifically?" she asked. "There are plenty of other quiet students he could pick on, but he's focused on you. Why?" Tyler didn't have a good answer for Emma's question, at least not one he could share. Connor's interest in him was precisely what Tyler had been trying to avoid through his strategy of deliberate mediocrity. But that strategy had apparently backfired by making him more, rather than less, suspicious. "Maybe I just remind him of someone he doesn't like," Tyler suggested weakly. "Or maybe you remind him of someone he's threatened by," Emma countered, her journalist's instincts clearly working even when she didn't have all the information. "Connor's used to being the most important person in any room, but you make him uncertain about something. I can see it in how he watches you." Before Tyler could respond to Emma's unsettling observation, their conversation was interrupted by an announcement over the school's public address system. Principal Morrison's voice filled the classroom, inviting all students to attend the Tri-County Wrestling Championship that would be held in the gymnasium on Saturday. The announcement included details about the tournament's significance, the presence of college scouts, and the scholarship opportunities available to winners. Tyler felt every muscle in his body tense as the announcement continued, describing exactly the kind of competition he had dominated for 3 consecutive years at his previous school. Around him, his classmates showed minimal interest in the wrestling tournament, but Tyler caught Connor turning to look directly at him with an expression of sharp curiosity. After class, Connor approached Tyler with a casualness that Tyler had learned to recognize as dangerous. "So, Tyler," Connor said, falling into step beside him as they walked toward the hallway, "are you planning to check out the wrestling tournament this weekend?" Tyler forced himself to maintain his usual quiet demeanor, despite the alarm bells ringing in his head. "Probably not," he replied. "Not really into wrestling." Connor's eyebrows rose slightly, and Tyler realized he had made a mistake. His dismissal of the wrestling tournament had been too quick, too definitive for someone who was supposedly just uninterested in the sport. "Really?" Connor said, his voice carrying a note of genuine surprise. "You seem like the type who might appreciate wrestling. It's all about technique and strategy, mental games as much as physical strength. Seems like it would appeal to someone as smart as you obviously are." Tyler recognized that Connor was testing him, probing for reactions that might reveal hidden knowledge or interest. "I'm more of a books than sports kind of person," Tyler said, trying to reinforce his carefully constructed image. "See, that's what's interesting about you, Tyler," Connor replied, stopping suddenly and turning to face him directly. "You say you're a books than sports person, but you move like an athlete. You have the reflexes, the balance, the spatial awareness. I've been watching you, and nothing about your body language suggests someone who's never been seriously involved in athletics." Tyler felt his carefully constructed facade beginning to crumble under Connor's perceptive analysis. Connor was far more observant than Tyler had given him credit for, and his suspicions were moving dangerously close to the truth Tyler had been desperately trying to hide. "I played some recreational sports when I was younger," Tyler said, which was technically true, even though it massively understated his competitive wrestling career. "What kind of sports?" Connor pressed, clearly sensing that he was finally getting somewhere. Tyler hesitated, realizing that any specific answer would invite follow-up questions that might lead Connor toward discovering his wrestling background. "Just typical kid stuff," he said vaguely. "Nothing serious." Connor smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had just confirmed a suspicion. "You know what I think, Tyler Matthews? I think you're hiding something significant about your athletic background. And I think whatever you're hiding is connected to why you're so determined to stay invisible at this school." The conversation was interrupted by the warning bell for next period, but Connor's final words carried clear implications. Tyler's attempts to hide his wrestling expertise had actually made Connor more rather than less suspicious, and Connor was now actively investigating Tyler's athletic background. As Tyler walked to his next class, he realized that his situation had become untenable. Connor's intelligence and persistence meant that discovery was probably inevitable. But the question remained whether Tyler could control the circumstances of that discovery, or whether Connor would expose him at a time and place of Connor's choosing. The tournament was 3 days away, and Tyler found himself facing the most difficult decision of his time at Riverside High. Continue hiding and risk Connor's escalating harassment, or reveal his true capabilities and face whatever consequences came from abandoning his carefully constructed anonymity. Friday afternoon arrived with the weight of inevitability that Tyler had been dreading all week. The final bell had rung, students were streaming toward their weekend plans, and Tyler was walking toward what he knew would be the breaking point that Connor Blake had been methodically orchestrating. Tyler's locker was located in the senior hallway, a strategic mistake he'd made during his first week when he'd prioritized convenience over security. Now, surrounded by Connor's territory, and with most teachers already departed for the weekend, Tyler found himself isolated in exactly the way Connor had planned. Connor was waiting by Tyler's locker with his full entourage. Ryan Torres leaning against the adjacent lockers with his arms crossed, Marcus Webb bouncing slightly on his toes with barely contained excitement, and 3 other football players, whose names Tyler didn't know, but whose intentions were unmistakably hostile. The group had positioned themselves to block both ends of the hallway, creating a corridor of intimidation that any observer would recognize as deliberately constructed. Rather than coincidental, Tyler approached his locker with measured steps, maintaining the careful composure that had served him through 4 weeks of escalating harassment. He could feel the predatory attention of Connor's group focused on him like a physical weight, and he recognized the signs of a confrontation that had been planned in advance. This wasn't going to be another casual encounter designed to test Tyler's responses. This was Connor's decisive move to force the submission he'd been building toward all month. "Tyler, my friend," Connor said as Tyler reached his locker, his voice carrying the false warmth that Tyler had learned to associate with imminent danger. "Perfect timing. We were just talking about you." Tyler began working his combination lock, focusing on the familiar sequence of numbers while hyper-aware of the positioning of Connor's allies around him. Ryan had moved to Tyler's left side, Marcus to his right, effectively boxing him in against the row of lockers. The other football players had spread out to maintain their barrier across the hallway, ensuring that no other students would witness whatever Connor had planned. "We've been discussing your progress at Riverside High." Connor continued moving closer until he was standing directly behind Tyler. "And we've reached some conclusions about your character that I think you need to hear." Tyler opened his locker and began gathering his weekend homework, his movements deliberate and controlled, despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his system. He could sense the coiled violence in the boys surrounding him, the eager anticipation that came from adolescents who had been given permission to exercise power over someone they perceived as helpless. "The thing is, Tyler," Connor said, his voice dropping to the conversational tone that Tyler had learned meant serious threats were coming. "We've decided that you've been disrespectful to the traditions and social structure that make Riverside a special place. You've been acting like you're somehow above the community standards that the rest of us respect and maintain." Tyler closed his locker and turned to face Connor, recognizing that avoiding eye contact would only encourage further aggression. Connor stood less than 2 feet away, close enough that Tyler could see the calculation in his blue eyes and smell the mint gum he was chewing. Connor had the relaxed confidence of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to run. "I'm not sure what you mean," Tyler said, his voice steady despite the tension radiating through his body. "I've been trying to follow all the school rules." Ryan laughed, a sound devoid of humor that echoed off the empty lockers. "School rules," he repeated mockingly. "This isn't about school rules, Matthews. This is about respect." "Exactly." Connor agreed, his smile widening as if Ryan had made an excellent point. "Respect is something that has to be demonstrated, Tyler. It can't just be claimed or assumed. And frankly, your behavior has been consistently disrespectful since you arrived here." Marcus stepped closer, close enough that Tyler could feel his breath when he spoke. "You sit alone instead of trying to make friends with the right people. You keep your head down instead of participating in school spirit. You act like you're too good for the rest of us." Tyler found himself trapped in a triangle formed by Connor, Ryan, and Marcus, with the other football players maintaining their positions to prevent escape or intervention. The positioning was professional, suggesting that this group had conducted similar confrontations before and had developed tactics for maximizing intimidation while minimizing the risk of adult interference. "And then there's your attitude toward athletics," Connor continued, clearly building toward his main point. "You claim you're not interested in sports, but everything about your physical presence suggests serious athletic training. You move like a competitor, Tyler, but you refuse to compete. That's not just disrespectful to our athletic traditions, it's dishonest." Tyler felt his pulse quicken as Connor's accusations moved closer to the truth he'd been desperately trying to hide. Connor's analysis was more sophisticated than Tyler had anticipated, and his suspicions were becoming dangerously specific. "I've just never been very good at sports," Tyler said, maintaining his cover story despite the obvious skepticism on Connor's face. "See, that's exactly what I'm talking about," Connor replied, his voice taking on an edge of genuine anger. "You're lying to my face, Tyler. You're standing there telling me something that we both know isn't true, and that level of disrespect is exactly what we're here to address." The hallway had grown completely silent except for their voices, the usual sounds of after-school activity having faded as other students departed for their weekend plans. Tyler realized that Connor had timed this confrontation perfectly, ensuring maximum privacy for whatever he had planned. "So, here's what's going to happen," Connor continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow seemed more threatening than shouting. "You're going to demonstrate the proper respect for the athletic traditions of this school by participating in tomorrow's wrestling tournament." Tyler felt his carefully constructed world beginning to collapse around him. Connor's demand was impossible to fulfill without revealing exactly what Tyler had been trying to hide, but refusing would inevitably lead to escalating confrontation. "I can't do that," Tyler said quietly. "I'm not prepared for that kind of competition." "Of course you're not prepared," Marcus interjected with obvious glee. "That's exactly the point. You've been acting like you're too good for our school's activities, so now you get to prove how good you really are." Ryan nodded enthusiastically, clearly enjoying Tyler's obvious discomfort. "It'll be educational for everyone. The whole school will get to see what happens when someone who thinks they're special gets put in their place." Connor raised his hand for silence, and his companions immediately complied. The gesture demonstrated the absolute authority Connor wielded over his group and reinforced Tyler's understanding of how thoroughly he was outmatched in terms of social power. "Tyler," Connor said, his voice now carrying the tone of someone delivering an ultimatum, "you have two choices. You can sign up for tomorrow's wrestling tournament and demonstrate your commitment to being part of this school community, or you can face the consequences of continued disrespect." Tyler understood that Connor's offer was designed to be impossible to accept. Connor expected Tyler to refuse, which would justify whatever punishment Connor had planned. The tournament registration had closed 2 days earlier, making participation technically impossible even if Tyler wanted to compete. "Registration is already closed," Tyler pointed out, hoping to avoid having to explicitly refuse Connor's demand. "Actually, it's not," Connor replied, his smile returning with full force. "I spoke with Coach Anderson this morning and explained that there was a student who had been too modest to sign up, but who really wanted to participate. Coach Anderson was very understanding about making an exception for someone who showed late interest in the program." Tyler felt the trap closing around him as he realized how thoroughly Connor had planned this confrontation. Connor had anticipated Tyler's objections and had already eliminated his escape routes. The tournament was real, participation was possible, and refusal would confirm Connor's allegations about Tyler's arrogance and disrespect. "I don't have gear," Tyler said, grasping for any remaining excuse to avoid Connor's demand. "Coach Anderson has loaner equipment," Marcus said helpfully. "He's got everything you need in your size." Ryan pulled out his phone and showed Tyler a text message exchange with someone listed as Coach A that detailed the availability of wrestling gear and confirmed that late registration would be accepted for any interested student. Connor had been planning this confrontation for days, possibly weeks, and had systematically eliminated every possible excuse Tyler might offer. "So you see, Tyler," Connor said, his voice now carrying the satisfaction of someone who had successfully cornered his prey, "all the practical obstacles have been removed. The only question remaining is whether you're going to show proper respect for this school's athletic traditions, or continue to demonstrate the arrogance that's been bothering so many of your classmates." Tyler looked around at the faces surrounding him, seeing the eager anticipation of violence barely restrained by Connor's authority. These boys wanted him to refuse Connor's demand because they knew refusal would justify immediate physical retaliation. They were hoping Tyler would give them an excuse to escalate from psychological intimidation to actual assault. "And if I participate and lose?" Tyler asked, buying time while his mind raced through possible responses to Connor's ultimatum. Then you lose with dignity instead of avoiding competition out of cowardice, Connor replied. Losing while trying is respectable. Refusing to try because you're afraid of looking foolish is not. Tyler recognized the sophisticated manipulation in Connor's argument. Connor was appealing to concepts of honor and courage that Tyler actually believed in, using Tyler's own values against him to force compliance with Connor's agenda. It was psychological warfare conducted by someone who understood exactly which buttons to push. But here's the thing, Tyler, Connor continued, stepping even closer until they were almost touching. I don't think you're going to lose. I think you're going to surprise everyone, including yourself. I think you're going to discover capabilities you didn't know you had. The statement was loaded with implication, suggesting that Connor suspected Tyler was hiding significant wrestling ability. Tyler realized that Connor's entire plan was designed to force Tyler into a situation where his true capabilities would be revealed regardless of whether he won or lost. If Tyler dominated the tournament, Connor would be proven right about Tyler's deception. If Tyler performed poorly, Connor would have achieved his goal of public humiliation. I need to think about it, Tyler said finally, recognizing that he needed time to consider his extremely limited options. Connor's expression hardened, the friendly mask finally slipping to reveal the cold calculation underneath. Actually, Tyler, thinking time is over. You've had weeks to think about how to properly integrate into this school community, and you've consistently made the wrong choices. Ryan and Marcus stepped closer, closing the triangle until Tyler was pressed back against the lockers with no room to maneuver. The other football players moved in as well, creating a wall of bodies that eliminated any possibility of escape or outside intervention. So, here's what's going to happen right now, Connor continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried absolute menace. You're going to walk down to Coach Anderson's office and sign up for tomorrow's tournament. You're going to do it voluntarily and enthusiastically, showing proper appreciation for the opportunity to demonstrate your school spirit. Tyler felt the cold metal of the lockers against his back and realized that his carefully maintained strategy of submission and avoidance had finally reached its logical conclusion. Connor had systematically eliminated every alternative except complete capitulation or open resistance, and Tyler was running out of ways to maintain his cover without fighting back. "And if I refuse?" Tyler asked, though he already knew the answer. Connor's smile returned, but now it carried no pretense of warmth or friendship. "If you refuse, Tyler, then we're going to have a very different kind of educational experience. One that involves helping you understand respect through more direct methods." Marcus cracked his knuckles loudly, the sound echoing off the empty lockers like a gunshot. Ryan shifted his weight, preparing for violence that seemed increasingly inevitable. The other football players closed ranks, ensuring that no escape route remained available. Tyler found himself at the exact crossroads his father had warned him about. The moment when a battle chose you, regardless of your preference for avoiding conflict. Connor's ultimatum was designed to be impossible to accept without revealing Tyler's true capabilities, but refusing would lead to immediate physical confrontation that would also likely expose Tyler's fighting ability. For the first time since arriving at Riverside High, Tyler allowed himself to consider what would happen if he stopped hiding, stopped pretending to be weak, stopped allowing Connor Blake to dictate the terms of their relationship. The thought was both terrifying and liberating, representing everything Tyler had been trying to avoid, while simultaneously offering the only path toward ending Connor's systematic campaign of harassment. "You know what, Connor?" Tyler said quietly, his voice carrying a new quality that made Connor's eyes narrow with sudden uncertainty. "I think you're right about the tournament, I think it would be very educational for everyone. The parking lot outside Riverside High was nearly empty by the time Tyler emerged from Coach Anderson's office with a tournament registration form in his hand and a borrowed gear bag slung over his shoulder. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the asphalt, and the October air carried the crisp bite of approaching winter. Tyler walked slowly toward his car, his mind reeling from the conversation he'd just had with Coach Anderson and the magnitude of the decision he'd just made. Coach Anderson had been surprised but pleased by Tyler's late interest in the wrestling tournament. The coach was a compact man in his 50s with graying hair and the kind of direct gaze that came from decades of evaluating young athletes. He'd asked Tyler about his previous wrestling experience, and Tyler had found himself in the impossible position of having to provide enough information to justify his participation without revealing the full extent of his background. "I wrestled some at my previous school," Tyler had said, which was technically accurate even though it massively understated 3 state championships and recruitment by Division I universities. Coach Anderson had studied Tyler's slight build with professional interest. "What weight class?" he'd asked. 160, Tyler had replied, which was truthful, though it failed to mention that Tyler had never lost a match at that weight. "Good," Coach Anderson had said, making notes on his clipboard. "We've got a strong field at 160 this year. Should be competitive matches." Tyler had signed the registration form with a hand that trembled slightly, recognizing that his signature represented the end of 4 weeks of careful anonymity and the beginning of something he couldn't control or predict. Coach Anderson had handed him a gear bag containing wrestling shoes, headgear, and a plain blue singlet that would identify him as representing Riverside High. "Tournament starts at 9 tomorrow morning," Coach Anderson had said. "Weigh-ins are at 8. You should probably get some rest tonight and eat a good breakfast. First tournament nerves can be rough." Tyler had nodded and thanked Coach Anderson, accepting advice that was completely unnecessary for someone with his level of experience, but perfectly reasonable for the novice wrestler Tyler was pretending to be. The deception felt increasingly uncomfortable, but Tyler was committed to maintaining his cover for as long as possible. Now, walking across the empty parking lot with the gear bag weighing heavily on his shoulder, Tyler felt the full impact of what he'd committed himself to. Tomorrow morning, in front of an audience that would include college scouts, his classmates, and most importantly, Connor Blake, Tyler would step onto a wrestling mat for the first time since leaving California. The question that haunted him was whether he could control his performance carefully enough to avoid suspicion while still achieving whatever goal had driven him to accept Connor's ultimatum. Tyler's phone buzzed with a text message as he reached his car. The message was from Emma. "Heard you signed up for the wrestling tournament. Are you insane?" Tyler stared at Emma's message for a long moment before typing back, "Probably, long story." Emma's response came immediately. "I'll be there tomorrow to take pictures for the school paper. Try not to get killed." Tyler smiled despite his anxiety, recognizing Emma's attempt to inject humor into a situation that had become genuinely dangerous. Emma's presence at the tournament would provide at least one friendly face in what was likely to be a hostile audience, though Tyler worried about exposing her to whatever consequences would follow his performance. The drive home gave Tyler time to think about the conversation he would need to have with his father. David Matthews had been asking increasingly pointed questions about Tyler's adjustment to Riverside High, clearly sensing that something was wrong despite Tyler's attempts to minimize the problems he was facing. Tonight, Tyler would have to explain not just Connor's harassment campaign, but also his decision to compete in the wrestling tournament. Tyler's family lived in a modest 2-story house on the outskirts of Millfield, surrounded by the kind of large yards and mature trees that had attracted his parents to the area. David Matthews worked from a home office, providing corporate security consulting to clients across the Pacific Northwest, which meant he was usually available when Tyler arrived home from school. Today, Tyler found his father in the converted garage that served as their training space, working through a series of grappling drills with focused intensity. David Matthews was 45 years old, with the lean, efficient build of someone who had competed at the highest levels of wrestling and had maintained his conditioning through years of continued training. He'd been a Division I All-American in college and had competed professionally for several years before transitioning into corporate security work. More importantly for Tyler, David had been the coach and mentor who had guided Tyler's wrestling career from childhood through his state championship victories. "How was school?" David asked, not pausing in his drill sequence, but clearly aware of Tyler's presence in the doorway. "Complicated," Tyler replied, setting down the gear bag with enough emphasis that his father immediately stopped training and turned to face him. David's eyes went immediately to the wrestling gear bag, and Tyler saw recognition and concern flash across his father's face. "Want to tell me about it?" David asked quietly. Tyler spent the next 30 minutes explaining Connor Blake's systematic harassment campaign, his investigation into Tyler's background, and the ultimatum that had forced Tyler to register for the tournament. David listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grim as Tyler described the escalating pressure and the impossible choice he'd faced in the hallway. "So, you're competing tomorrow," David said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "I didn't see any other option," Tyler replied. "Connor had eliminated every excuse I could think of, and refusing would have led to immediate physical confrontation." David nodded slowly, understanding the tactical situation Tyler had been placed in. "What's your plan for the tournament?" Tyler had been dreading this question because he didn't have a satisfactory answer. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "If I dominate, everyone will know I was lying about my experience. If I lose badly, Connor will have achieved his goal of humiliating me publicly. And if you perform somewhere in the middle," David asked, "then Connor will be suspicious but not certain, and the harassment will probably continue until he figures out what I'm really hiding." David was quiet for several minutes, clearly working through the strategic implications of Tyler's situation. Finally, he spoke with the tone of someone who had reached a difficult decision. "Tyler," David said, "I think your time of hiding is over. Connor Blake has maneuvered you into a position where any choice you make will reveal something about your true capabilities. Given that reality, you need to decide what you want that revelation to look like." Tyler felt a mixture of relief and terror at his father's words. Relief because he was finally receiving permission to stop pretending to be something he wasn't, and terror because stepping out of hiding would change everything about his life at Riverside High. "What are you suggesting?" Tyler asked. David smiled for the first time since Tyler had begun his explanation. "I'm suggesting that tomorrow morning you go to that tournament and show everyone exactly who Tyler Matthews really is. No more hiding, no more pretending to be weak, no more letting bullies dictate the terms of your existence." Tyler felt something shift inside him at his father's words, a loosening of the tight control he'd maintained over his true nature for the past 4 weeks. "And after the tournament, you deal with whatever consequences come from being honest about your capabilities," David replied. "But you deal with them as yourself, not as some character you've been playing to avoid conflict." David walked over to the gear bag and pulled out the borrowed wrestling shoes, examining them with professional interest. "These should work fine," he said. "Want to run through some drills to shake off the rust?" Tyler hesitated for a moment, recognizing that accepting his father's offer would represent a commitment to abandoning his strategy of concealment. Then he nodded and began changing into workout clothes, feeling for the first time in weeks like he was preparing to be himself rather than performing a role. As Tyler laced up his wrestling shoes, his father offered one final piece of advice. "Remember, son, tomorrow isn't about Connor Blake or Riverside High or proving anything to anyone else. Tomorrow is about competing with honor and showing respect for the sport that made you who you are." Tyler nodded, understanding that his father was giving him permission to wrestle not just with his full capabilities, but with the passion and dedication that had driven him to 3 state championships. Tomorrow, for better or worse, Tyler Matthews would step out of hiding and face whatever consequences came from revealing his true nature. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that seemed designed for competition. Tyler woke before his alarm, his body responding to the familiar pre-tournament routine that had been ingrained through years of high-level wrestling. The nervous energy that had kept him tossing through the night was now transforming into the focused anticipation he recognized from his most successful competitions. Tyler's breakfast was carefully planned. Oatmeal with bananas for sustained energy, orange juice for quick fuel, and enough water to ensure proper hydration without affecting his ability to make weight. David Matthews sat across from him at the kitchen table, drinking coffee and reviewing the tournament bracket that Coach Anderson had emailed the night before. 16 wrestlers in your weight class, David said, studying the names and school affiliations. I recognize some of these programs. Cascade Valley has a strong tradition, and Mountain View sent 2 kids to state last year. Tyler nodded, feeling the familiar mixture of excitement and anxiety that preceded any serious competition. He'd competed against wrestlers from similar programs during his championship runs in California, and he understood that today's competition would be significantly more challenging than Connor Blake had anticipated. "Any strategy recommendations?" Tyler asked, though he already knew his father's philosophy about tournament wrestling. "Wrestle your match," David replied, using the phrase that had guided Tyler through dozens of competitions. "Don't worry about your opponent's reputation or record. Don't wrestle up or down to anyone's expectations. Just execute your technique and let your preparation carry you through." Tyler finished his breakfast and gathered his gear, including the wrestling shoes he'd borrowed from Coach Anderson and the blue Riverside High singlet that would identify him to the crowd. David would be accompanying him to provide corner coaching, a role he'd filled throughout Tyler's competitive career. The drive to Riverside High took 15 minutes through Millfield's quiet residential streets. Tyler spent the time in focused silence, running through technical sequences in his mind and visualizing the kind of performance that had made him a state champion. He was no longer thinking about Connor Blake's expectations or the social consequences of revealing his true abilities. This morning, Tyler Matthews was simply a wrestler preparing for competition. The gymnasium was already bustling with activity when Tyler and his father arrived at 7:30. Wrestling mats had been laid out across the basketball court, creating 4 competition areas that would allow multiple matches to proceed simultaneously. Portable bleachers had been assembled along both sides of the gym, and Tyler could see early arriving spectators beginning to claim seats for what promised to be a well-attended tournament. Tyler checked in with Coach Anderson, who seemed genuinely excited about having a Riverside High wrestler competing at the tournament. "Good to see you, Matthews," Coach Anderson said, consulting his clipboard. "You're seeded 8th in your bracket based on your lack of recent competition results. Should make for some interesting first-round matchups." Tyler nodded, understanding that his 8th seed was based on Coach Anderson's assumption that Tyler was a relative novice. The seeding would actually work in Tyler's favor, ensuring that he wouldn't face the bracket's top wrestlers until the later rounds if he advanced that far. Weigh-ins proceeded smoothly, with Tyler making the 160-pound limit with 3 pounds to spare. His compact build and excellent conditioning were immediately apparent to the other coaches and wrestlers present, though Tyler was careful to maintain his quiet demeanor and avoid drawing unnecessary attention to himself. As 9 o'clock approached and the tournament prepared to begin, Tyler found himself in the familiar ritual of final preparation that had preceded every significant match of his wrestling career. He went through his warm-up routine with methodical precision, light jogging to elevate his heart rate, dynamic stretching to prepare his muscles, and technical drilling to remind his body of the movements that had become second nature through years of practice. David Matthews watched his son's preparation with quiet satisfaction, recognizing the transformation that was taking place before his eyes. The nervous, conflicted teenager who had been hiding his true nature for weeks was disappearing, replaced by the focused competitor who had dominated California wrestling for 3 consecutive years. "You ready?" David asked as the tournament. Officials called wrestlers to their respective mats for the first round. Tyler looked around the gymnasium, taking in the assembled crowd that included his classmates, college scouts, and somewhere in the bleachers, Connor Blake. For the first time in weeks, Tyler Matthews felt completely ready to be exactly who he was. "I'm ready," Tyler said, and walked toward the mat where his wrestling career at Riverside High was about to begin. The gymnasium buzzed with anticipation as Connor Blake settled into his seat in the front row of the bleachers, flanked by Ryan Torres and Marcus Webb on either side. Connor's positioning was deliberate, ensuring that Tyler would see him immediately upon entering the competition area. Around them, other Riverside High students had gathered to witness what Connor had promised would be Tyler's public humiliation. Their conversations filled with speculation about how quickly the quiet transfer student would be eliminated from serious competition. Connor surveyed the wrestling mats with the satisfaction of someone whose carefully orchestrated plan was finally reaching its climax. He had maneuvered Tyler Matthews into an impossible situation where any outcome would serve Connor's purposes. If Tyler performed poorly, Connor would have achieved his goal of demonstrating Tyler's weakness to the entire school community. If Tyler performed surprisingly well, Connor would be vindicated in his suspicions that Tyler had been deliberately hiding his capabilities. Either way, Connor would emerge from the day with his authority reinforced and his dominance over Tyler. "Confirmed. This is going to be beautiful," Ryan said, leaning over to speak directly into Connor's ear. "Matthews is about to get destroyed in front of everyone." Marcus nodded enthusiastically, his excitement barely contained as he watched wrestlers warming up on the mats below. "I heard he's never even been in a real wrestling match before. This is going to be over in like 30 seconds. Connor smiled but said nothing, his attention focused on analyzing the other wrestlers in Tyler's weight class. Connor had done his research, consulting with Coach Anderson about the level of competition Tyler would face and identifying several opponents who had reputations for aggressive, dominant wrestling styles. Connor was particularly interested in watching Tyler face Jake Morrison from Mountain View High, a thick, powerful wrestler who had placed 3rd at the state tournament the previous year and was known for punishing opponents who couldn't match his intensity. Emma Rodriguez had positioned herself near the scorer's table with her camera, ready to document the tournament for the school newspaper. She caught Connor's eye and gave him a look that clearly conveyed her opinion of his role in forcing Tyler into this situation. Connor responded with a friendly wave, genuinely enjoying Emma's obvious concern for Tyler's well-being. Emma's protective instincts toward Tyler only reinforced Connor's belief that Tyler was hiding something significant, and Connor looked forward to watching Emma's reaction when Tyler's deception was finally exposed. The tournament officials called wrestlers to their respective mats for the opening ceremonies, and Connor leaned forward with intense interest as Tyler Matthews emerged from the warm-up area wearing the blue singlet of Riverside High. Connor had expected to see nervousness or fear in Tyler's demeanor, some sign that the pressure of public competition was affecting his confidence. Instead, Connor was surprised to observe that Tyler moved with fluid grace and obvious athletic competence, warming up with a series of movements that suggested familiarity with wrestling techniques. Connor's eyebrows rose slightly as he watched Tyler go through his pre-match routine. Tyler's warm-up was methodical and professional, incorporating stretches and drills that demonstrated technical knowledge beyond what Connor had anticipated. Tyler's body language had changed completely from the nervous, hesitant teenager Connor had been harassing for weeks. On the wrestling mat, Tyler appeared focused and confident, moving like someone who belonged in competitive athletics. "Does Matthews look different to you guys?" Connor asked quietly, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that his companions had rarely heard before. Ryan studied Tyler's warm-up routine with growing confusion. "He definitely moves like he knows what he's doing," Ryan admitted. "That's weird." Marcus was squinting at Tyler with obvious bewilderment. Where did all that come from? Yesterday he could barely walk down the hallway without looking scared. Connor didn't respond immediately, his mind working through the implications of Tyler's transformation. Either Tyler was an exceptionally good actor who had been concealing significant athletic ability, or something about the competitive environment was bringing out capabilities that Tyler genuinely hadn't known he possessed. Connor found himself hoping for the latter explanation, because the former would mean that Tyler had been playing a much more sophisticated game than Connor had given him credit for. The first round of matches began with wrestlers from the lighter weight classes, giving Connor time to continue observing Tyler's preparation. Tyler was working with an older man who Connor assumed was his father, going through technical drills that demonstrated coordination and timing that couldn't be developed overnight. Tyler's movements were crisp and precise, his technique fundamentally sound in ways that suggested years of serious training. Connor felt the first stirrings of genuine concern as he watched Tyler's preparation continue. Connor had built his entire plan around the assumption that Tyler was essentially a fraud who would crumble under the pressure of real competition. The possibility that Tyler might actually be competent at wrestling had never seriously occurred to Connor, and he found himself reconsidering the wisdom of forcing this confrontation. When Tyler's weight class was called to the mats, Connor watched with intense focus as Tyler approached his first opponent. Tyler had been matched against Steve Chen from Cascade Valley High, a solid wrestler with a 15-8 record who was known for his conditioning and relentless pace. Connor expected this match to reveal immediately whether Tyler's confident warm-up had been genuine preparation or elaborate bluffing. The referee called both wrestlers to the center of the mat for final instructions, and Connor was surprised to see that Tyler appeared completely relaxed despite the crowd of spectators watching his every move. Tyler shook hands with his opponent with genuine respect, looked directly at the referee during the rules explanation, and took his starting position with the casual competence of someone who had done this many times before. Connor leaned forward as the referee's whistle started the match, expecting to see Tyler immediately overwhelmed by his opponent's experience and aggression. Instead, Connor watched in growing amazement as Tyler smoothly avoided Steve Chen's initial attacks, countering with technique that was both effective and fundamentally sound. Tyler's footwork was excellent, his balance unshakable, and his timing precise in ways that spoke to extensive competitive experience. Within the first 30 seconds of the match, Connor realized that Tyler Matthews was not the inexperienced novice that Connor had assumed him to be. Tyler moved like a wrestler, thought like a wrestler, and competed with the confidence of someone who had faced serious opposition many times before. Steve Chen, who had entered the match expecting an easy victory against Riverside High's unknown in quantity, found himself dealing with an opponent who neutralized his attacks effortlessly and began implementing offensive strategies of surprising sophistication. Connor's mouth fell open as Tyler executed a perfectly timed single-leg takedown that put Steve Chen on his back within the first minute of the match. The takedown was textbook perfect, demonstrating technique that could only be developed through years of dedicated training. Tyler's follow-up was equally impressive, transitioning immediately to a controlling position that prevented Chen from escaping or countering. The crowd around Connor began to murmur with surprise as Tyler continued to dominate a wrestler who had been expected to advance deep into the tournament bracket. Tyler's performance was methodical and professional, showing respect for his opponent, while systematically dismantling Chen's offensive capabilities. With 2 minutes remaining in the first period, Tyler secured a pin that ended the match decisively and sent him advancing to the second round. Connor sat in stunned silence as Tyler stood and shook hands with his defeated opponent, showing the kind of sportsmanship that came from genuine respect for competition rather than arrogance about his own abilities. Tyler's celebration was subdued and respectful, acknowledging the crowd's applause without showboating or drawing unnecessary attention to himself. Everything about Tyler's performance and demeanor suggested a wrestler with extensive experience in high-level competition. Ryan and Marcus were staring at Connor with obvious confusion, clearly expecting him to explain what they had just witnessed. "That was not supposed to happen," Marcus said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "No kidding," Ryan replied, watching Tyler walk off the mat toward where his father was waiting with quiet pride. "Where the hell did that come from?" Connor couldn't answer because he was still processing the magnitude of his miscalculation. Tyler Matthews was not an inexperienced amateur who could be humiliated through forced participation in athletic competition. Tyler was clearly a serious wrestler with advanced technical skills and competitive experience that Connor had completely failed to detect during his investigation. Connor's carefully constructed plan to expose Tyler's weakness had instead revealed capabilities that made Tyler potentially the most accomplished athlete in Riverside High. Emma Rodriguez approached Connor's group with her camera, her expression mixing satisfaction with genuine curiosity. "So, Connor," she said, her voice loud enough that nearby spectators could overhear, "how are you feeling about your prediction that Tyler would get destroyed in his first match?" Connor forced himself to maintain his confident facade despite the complete collapse of his expectations. "One match doesn't prove anything, Emma. Let's see how he does when the competition gets serious." Emma smiled with obvious enjoyment of Connor's discomfort. "Oh, I think the competition is about to get very serious indeed. Tyler's second-round opponent is Jake Morrison from Mountain View. You know, the guy who placed third at state last year." Connor felt his stomach tighten as Emma's words confirmed his worst fears about the direction this tournament was heading. Jake Morrison was exactly the kind of opponent Connor had hoped would eliminate Tyler quickly and decisively. Morrison was bigger, stronger, and more aggressive than Steve Chen, with a wrestling style that overwhelmed opponents through superior conditioning and relentless pressure. If Tyler could compete effectively against Morrison, it would prove that Tyler's wrestling ability was genuine rather than fortunate. Tyler's second-round match began 20 minutes later, giving Connor time to watch Jake Morrison warm up and confirm his reputation for physical dominance. Morrison was thick and powerful, with the kind of intimidating presence that had made him successful against high-level opposition. Morrison's pre-match routine emphasized strength and aggression, and Connor found himself hoping that Morrison's style would expose whatever limitations Tyler's wrestling ability might have. When Tyler and Morrison were called to the mat, Connor noticed that several college scouts had moved closer to observe the match. Word was apparently spreading through the wrestling community that Riverside High's unknown wrestler was performing at a level that warranted serious attention. Connor realized with growing dread that Tyler's performance was attracting exactly the kind of recognition that would make Tyler's deception impossible to maintain. The match began with Morrison immediately attempting to impose his physical superiority. Through aggressive shot attempts and constant pressure, Connor expected Tyler to be overwhelmed by Morrison's intensity, forced into defensive wrestling that would eventually lead to his defeat. Instead, Connor watched Tyler adapt his strategy to neutralize Morrison's strengths while implementing offensive attacks that exploited Morrison's defensive weaknesses. Tyler's technique against Morrison was even more impressive than his performance. Against Steve Chen, Tyler's footwork kept him constantly in position to defend or attack. His hand control prevented Morrison from securing the grips necessary for his power moves, and his conditioning proved equal to Morrison's, despite Morrison's reputation for superior fitness. Within the first period, Tyler had scored 2 takedowns against Morrison, while surrendering only a single escape point. Connor felt physically sick as he watched Tyler dismantle an opponent who had been expected to dominate their bracket. Morrison's frustration was obvious as his usual tactics failed to generate scoring opportunities against Tyler's defensive technique. Tyler, meanwhile, appeared completely comfortable with the pace and intensity of elite-level competition, competing with the calm confidence of someone who had faced similar challenges many times before. The second period saw Tyler continue his systematic domination of Morrison, adding a near fall that put him ahead by 8 points and effectively ended any suspense about the match's outcome. Morrison's attempts to mount a comeback became increasingly desperate, leaving him vulnerable to the kind of counters that Tyler executed with textbook precision. When Tyler secured another takedown with 30 seconds remaining, Morrison's shoulders visibly sagged in recognition that he had been thoroughly outclassed. Tyler's victory over Jake Morrison sent shockwaves through the wrestling community present at the tournament. Morrison's third-place finish at the state tournament the previous year had established him as one of the elite wrestlers in the region, making Tyler's dominant performance a clear statement about his own capabilities. College scouts were now openly discussing Tyler's technique and asking Coach Anderson about his background and recruiting status. Connor sat in his seat with growing horror as he realized the full scope of his miscalculation. Tyler Matthews was not just a competent wrestler. Tyler was potentially a state championship caliber competitor who had been deliberately concealing his abilities for reasons Connor was only beginning to understand. Connor's plan to humiliate Tyler had instead provided Tyler with a platform to demonstrate excellence that would reshape his entire status at Riverside High and beyond. Emma Rodriguez appeared at Connor's side again, this time accompanied by several other students who had been following Tyler's unexpected success. "Connor," Emma said with obvious satisfaction, "I'm starting to think you might have made a serious error in judgment about Tyler Matthews." Connor couldn't formulate a response because he was still processing the implications of Tyler's performance. Everything Connor thought he knew about Tyler had been wrong, and Connor was beginning to understand that Tyler's months of apparent weakness had been a calculated performance designed to hide capabilities that would have attracted unwanted attention. As Tyler advanced to the semifinals against the tournament's second seed, Connor realized that his carefully constructed social dominance at Riverside High was about to face its most serious challenge. Tyler Matthews was not the weak target Connor had assumed him to be. Tyler was a legitimate elite athlete who had been playing a game Connor hadn't even known existed, and Connor was beginning to suspect that he had been outmaneuvered from the very beginning. The semi-final match arrived with an electricity that Connor could feel throughout the gymnasium. Word of Tyler's dominant performances had spread beyond the wrestling community to include the general spectators, and the bleachers were now packed with students, parents, and local wrestling enthusiasts who had come to witness what appeared to be the emergence of a legitimate championship contender. Tyler's opponent was Derek Walsh from Hillcrest Academy, the tournament's second seed and a wrestler who had qualified for the state tournament in each of his 3 high school seasons. Connor watched Tyler's pre-match routine with a mixture of fascination and growing dread. Tyler's warm-up had evolved throughout the tournament from competent to professional to now almost ritualistic in its precision and focus. Tyler moved through his stretching and drilling with the methodical attention to detail that Connor recognized from elite athletes who had learned to prepare their bodies and minds for peak performance under pressure. David Matthews stood beside his son during the warm-up, offering quiet technical advice and emotional support with the easy familiarity of a coach who had guided this wrestler through many similar situations. Connor could see the pride in David's posture and expression, the satisfaction of watching years of training and development culminate in exactly this kind of performance. It was clear that Tyler's wrestling ability was not some recently discovered talent, but the result of sustained dedication and expert coaching over many years. Derek Walsh represented everything Connor had hoped Tyler would face in serious competition: superior size, extensive experience, and the kind of aggressive wrestling style that had overwhelmed lesser opponents throughout Walsh's career. Walsh warmed up with obvious confidence, acknowledging the college scouts who had positioned themselves near his corner and projecting the casual arrogance of someone who expected to advance to the finals regardless of his opponent's identity. When the wrestlers were called to the mat, Connor noticed that the gymnasium had grown noticeably quieter, as if the assembled crowd recognized that they were about to witness something significant. Tyler and Walsh shook hands with mutual respect, but Connor could see the calculation in both wrestlers' eyes as they evaluated each other's strengths and potential weaknesses during the referee's final instructions. The match began with Walsh immediately attempting to establish physical dominance through aggressive hand fighting and constant forward pressure. Connor expected Tyler to be overwhelmed by Walsh's superior size and experience, forced into the kind of defensive wrestling that would eventually lead to his defeat. Instead, Connor watched Tyler seamlessly adjust his strategy to neutralize Walsh's advantages, while implementing offensive attacks that exploited Walsh's commitment to power wrestling. Tyler's performance against Walsh demonstrated a level of tactical sophistication that left Connor speechless. Tyler's technique was not just fundamentally sound, but strategically brilliant, adapting moment by moment to Walsh's adjustments while maintaining constant offensive pressure. Tyler's conditioning proved superior to Walsh's despite Walsh's reputation for elite fitness, and Tyler's mental composure under pressure suggested experience with high-stakes competition that extended far beyond anything available at the high school level. The first period ended with Tyler ahead 4-2 on 2 takedowns, having effectively neutralized Walsh's size advantage through superior technique and tactical awareness. Walsh's frustration was becoming obvious as his usual methods failed to generate scoring opportunities against Tyler's defensive system. Tyler, meanwhile, appeared completely comfortable with the pace and intensity of elite competition, wrestling with the calm confidence that Connor was beginning to recognize as Tyler's true nature. Connor felt physically ill as he watched Tyler continue to dominate an opponent who represented the highest level of regional high school wrestling. Walsh's desperation was increasing with each failed attack, leaving him vulnerable to the kind of counters that Tyler was executing with championship-level precision. When Tyler scored a takedown with a perfectly timed duck under in the second period, Connor realized that Tyler was not just winning, but was systematically dismantling one of the best wrestlers in the state. The crowd's reaction to Tyler's performance was becoming increasingly enthusiastic, with even spectators who had arrived supporting other schools beginning to appreciate the technical excellence they were witnessing. Tyler's wrestling was beautiful to watch, combining power with finesse in ways that made difficult techniques appear effortless. College scouts were now taking detailed notes and asking increasingly pointed questions about Tyler's background and recruiting availability. Walsh's final desperate attempt to close the scoring gap came in the third period when he committed everything to a high-amplitude throw that might have succeeded against a less prepared opponent. Tyler's response was instantaneous and perfect, sprawling to defend the attack before transitioning immediately to a counter that put Walsh on his back for a near fall. The sequence demonstrated timing and technical knowledge that could only be developed through years of elite-level training and competition. Tyler's victory over Derek Walsh was decisive and comprehensive, sending him to the championship finals against Tommy Rodriguez from Oak Grove High, the tournament's top seed and defending regional champion. The magnitude of Tyler's achievement was not lost on anyone present. An unknown wrestler from a school with virtually no wrestling tradition had just defeated the second-best wrestler in the region and was now one match away from a championship that would establish him as a legitimate state title contender. Connor sat in stunned silence as Tyler walked off the mat to enthusiastic applause from the crowd. Tyler's celebration remained subdued and respectful, acknowledging the support, while maintaining focus on the championship match that awaited him. Tyler's composure under pressure and sportsmanship in victory demonstrated character development that extended far beyond athletic ability, suggesting a maturity and perspective that Connor had completely failed to recognize during their previous encounters. Emma Rodriguez approached Connor one final time, her camera capturing the stunned expressions of Connor and his companions. "So, Connor," Emma said with obvious enjoyment, "any thoughts on how Tyler's wrestling career is developing?" Connor couldn't respond because he was still processing the complete collapse of everything he had believed about Tyler Matthews. Tyler was not weak, was not inexperienced, and was definitely not the fraud Connor had assumed him to be. Tyler was a legitimate elite athlete who had been deliberately concealing capabilities that would have immediately established him as one of the most accomplished students at Riverside High. As Connor watched Tyler prepare for the championship finals, he began to understand that his months of harassment had been directed at someone who could have ended Connor's campaign of intimidation at any moment, but had chosen not to. Tyler's restraint had not been weakness, but strength, the kind of confidence that came from knowing exactly what he was capable of achieving when circumstances required action rather than avoidance. Connor realized with growing horror that he had been completely outmatched from the beginning, not by Tyler's wrestling ability, but by Tyler's intelligence and strategic thinking. Tyler had played a game Connor hadn't even known existed, maintaining perfect cover while gathering information about Connor's methods and motivations. Connor's plan to expose Tyler's weakness had instead exposed Connor's own limitations as both a strategist and a judge of character. The championship finals began with an electricity that Connor could feel throughout the gymnasium. Tommy Rodriguez was everything Tyler had been building toward. Undefeated in 2 seasons, recruited by 3 Division I universities, and possessing the kind of natural athletic ability that had made him dominant against every opponent he had faced. Rodriguez warmed up with the casual confidence of someone who expected victory, regardless of circumstances. His technique crisp, and his conditioning obviously superior to everyone else in the tournament. Connor found himself hoping that Rodriguez would provide the reality check that Tyler's previous opponents had failed to deliver. Rodriguez represented Tyler's first encounter with genuinely elite competition, the kind of opponent who would expose any limitations in Tyler's wrestling ability and perhaps restore some semblance of the natural order that Connor had expected to see throughout the tournament. When Tyler and Rodriguez were introduced to the crowd, Connor was surprised by the enthusiastic response Tyler received from the assembled spectators. Tyler had somehow become the crowd favorite, the unknown wrestler whose unexpected success had captured the imagination of everyone present, Rodriguez was respected but not beloved, seen as the established favorite rather than the inspiring underdog that Tyler had become. The match began with both wrestlers showing immediate respect for each other's abilities, neither attempting the kind of aggressive early attacks that had characterized their previous matches. Tyler and Rodriguez spent the first minute of the match in careful evaluation, probing for weaknesses while demonstrating technique that left no doubt about their elite status. Connor watched with growing fascination as two genuinely championship-caliber wrestlers began to implement strategies designed for the highest level of competition. Tyler's performance against Rodriguez was different from his previous matches. In its level of sophistication and tactical complexity, Tyler was no longer simply executing superior technique against overmatched opponents. Tyler was engaged in a chess match with an equally skilled competitor where small advantages would determine the outcome. Tyler's ability to compete at this level demonstrated wrestling development that extended far beyond anything Connor had imagined possible. The first period ended scoreless, with both wrestlers having neutralized each other's primary offensive weapons through superior defensive technique. Rodriguez's frustration was beginning to show as he encountered the first opponent of his high school career who could match his technical ability and tactical awareness. Tyler remained calm and focused, appearing completely comfortable with the pace and intensity of championship-level competition. Connor felt his last hopes for Tyler's defeat evaporate as the second period began with Tyler immediately scoring a takedown off a perfectly executed single-leg attack. Tyler's technique was flawless, his timing perfect, and his follow-up positioning exactly what was needed to maintain control against a wrestler of Rodriguez's ability. The takedown demonstrated not just technical skill, but the kind of mental toughness required to execute under maximum pressure. Rodriguez's response to Tyler's takedown was immediate and aggressive, attempting to tie the score through a series of increasingly desperate attacks that Tyler defended with championship-level composure. Tyler's defensive wrestling was beautiful to watch, combining technique with intelligence in ways that made Rodriguez's most dangerous attacks appear manageable. When Tyler added an escape and another takedown in the final minute of the second period, Connor realized that Tyler was not just competing with Rodriguez, but was actually winning against the best high school wrestler in the region. The third period became a showcase for Tyler's complete wrestling ability, as Rodriguez's conditioning began to fail under the pressure of Tyler's relentless pace. Tyler's fitness proved superior to Rodriguez's, despite Rodriguez's reputation for elite conditioning, and Tyler's technique remained crisp even as the match entered its most physically demanding phase. Tyler's final takedown came with 30 seconds remaining, a perfectly timed double leg that put the match beyond Rodriguez's ability to recover. Tyler's victory over Tommy Rodriguez sent the gymnasium into pandemonium as the assembled crowd recognized that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Tyler had not just won the tournament. Tyler had dominated every opponent he faced while demonstrating wrestling ability that established him as a legitimate contender for state championship honors. College scouts were now openly competing for Tyler's attention, and Coach Anderson was fielding inquiries about Tyler's recruiting status and academic qualifications. Connor sat motionless in his seat as Tyler was presented with the championship trophy, surrounded by college coaches, media representatives, and wrestling enthusiasts who wanted to understand how an unknown wrestler had emerged from nowhere to defeat the best competition in the region. Tyler's interview with the tournament announcer revealed that he had won 3 consecutive state championships at his previous school before his family's move to Oregon, information that explained his dominance while raising questions about why he had chosen to conceal his background. Emma Rodriguez captured Connor's expression as Tyler held his championship trophy, the photograph perfectly documenting Connor's shock and recognition of his complete miscalculation. Connor realized that Tyler's months of apparent weakness had been a sophisticated performance designed to avoid exactly the attention that today's victory would inevitably bring. Tyler had sacrificed his anonymous status to defend himself against Connor's harassment, demonstrating both the restraint to avoid unnecessary conflict and the capability to end it decisively when circumstances required action. As the crowd began to disperse and Tyler was surrounded by people congratulating him on his unexpected championship, Connor found himself alone with the realization that he had been completely outmaneuvered by someone he had assumed was helpless. Tyler Matthews was not the weak target Connor had believed him to be. Tyler was a legitimate elite athlete who had been playing a game Connor hadn't understood, and Connor's campaign of harassment had ultimately forced Tyler to reveal capabilities that would reshape every relationship at Riverside High. Monday morning at Riverside High arrived with an atmosphere that Connor Blake had never experienced before in his 4 years at the school. The hallways buzzed with excitement about Tyler Matthews' unexpected wrestling championship, and everywhere Connor looked, he saw students wearing hastily printed t-shirts celebrating Tyler's victory with slogans like "Silent Thunder" and "The Riverside Wrestler." The trophy case that had once displayed Connor's football achievements now prominently featured Tyler's championship trophy, accompanied by newspaper clippings describing his dominant performance at the regional tournament. Connor walked through the hallways with a growing sense of displacement as he observed how completely Tyler's status had changed overnight. Students who had previously ignored Tyler now approached him with genuine respect and admiration, seeking autographs and asking questions about his wrestling technique. Teachers who had barely acknowledged Tyler's presence now stopped to congratulate him on his achievement and inquire about his college recruiting prospects. Most significantly, several underclassmen who had previously looked up to Connor were now clearly more interested in associating with Tyler than with the football captain who had once seemed untouchable. The transformation in Tyler's demeanor was equally dramatic and far more unsettling to Connor than the change in how others treated him. Tyler no longer walked with the hesitant, nervous posture that had characterized his first weeks at Riverside High. Instead, Tyler moved through the school with quiet confidence, acknowledging congratulations graciously while maintaining the kind of humble dignity that made his achievement seem even more impressive. Tyler's eye contact was direct and steady, his voice clear and strong, and his overall presence suggested someone who was finally comfortable being exactly who he was. Connor's first direct encounter with the new Tyler Matthews occurred at Tyler's locker, the same location where Connor had delivered his ultimatum about the wrestling tournament just 4 days earlier. Connor approached with Ryan Torres and Marcus Webb, expecting to find Tyler in a mood of triumphant gloating that would justify Connor's continued antagonism. Instead, Connor found Tyler organizing his books with calm efficiency while discussing advanced mathematics concepts with Emma Rodriguez and 2 other students who had apparently sought Tyler out for academic help. "Tyler," Connor said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone that had served him well in previous encounters. "Congratulations on your wrestling success this weekend." Tyler looked up from his locker with direct eye contact that Connor found immediately unsettling. Tyler's gaze was steady and confident, showing no trace of the nervousness or deference that Connor had grown accustomed to seeing. "Thank you, Connor," Tyler replied, his voice clear and strong. "I appreciate that." Connor had expected Tyler to be either defensive about his previous deception or arrogant about his newly revealed capabilities. Instead, Tyler's response was gracious and straightforward, acknowledging Connor's congratulations while maintaining dignity that made Connor's previous harassment seem petty and misguided. Emma Rodriguez watched the interaction with obvious interest, her journalist's instincts clearly engaged by the confrontation between Riverside High's former social king and its newly emerged champion. "Connor," Emma said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I imagine Tyler's wrestling performance was quite different from what you expected when you suggested he compete. Connor felt heat rise in his cheeks as Emma's comment drew attention to his role in forcing Tyler into the tournament. Several nearby students turned to listen, clearly curious about the dynamics between Connor and Tyler that had led to Tyler's dramatic emergence as a wrestling champion. I always thought Tyler had hidden potential, Connor said, attempting to reframe his previous harassment as supportive mentorship. Sometimes people need encouragement to show what they're really capable of. Tyler studied Connor's face for a long moment, and Connor had the uncomfortable sensation that Tyler was evaluating not just his words, but his character and motivations. Tyler's assessment was clearly complete and not particularly favorable, though Tyler's response remained diplomatic. "That's an interesting perspective," Tyler said quietly. "I suppose we all have different ideas about what kind of encouragement is most helpful." Connor recognized the subtle challenge in Tyler's words and felt the familiar urge to escalate the confrontation to re-establish his dominance. However, Connor also recognized that Tyler's new status as wrestling champion and local celebrity made aggressive tactics far more risky than they had been when Tyler was unknown and friendless. "Tyler," Connor said, attempting to regain control of the conversation, "I hope your wrestling success won't make you forget about the importance of fitting into the Riverside High community. Individual achievement is great, but it's teamwork and school spirit that really matter." Several students who had gathered to listen to the conversation exchanged glances at Connor's comment, clearly recognizing the threat implicit in his words about community and teamwork. Tyler's response was immediate and decisive, delivered with the kind of quiet authority that commanded attention without requiring volume. "Connor," Tyler said, his voice carrying across the hallway with perfect clarity, "I think we both know that I've learned quite a bit about the Riverside High community over the past few weeks. I've learned about how some people use the idea of community to justify behavior that's actually destructive to it. I've learned that real strength isn't about making other people feel weak, and that genuine leadership means helping others succeed rather than keeping them down." The hallway had grown completely quiet as Tyler's words registered with the assembled students. Connor felt dozens of eyes focused on him as Tyler's comments clearly referenced Connor's campaign of harassment, while maintaining enough diplomatic language to avoid direct accusations. Tyler continued, his voice remaining calm and measured, despite the significance of what he was saying. "I've also learned that sometimes the best way to serve a community is to show people what's possible when you stop hiding who you really are. Not everyone needs to be the loudest person in the room to make a meaningful contribution." Connor realized with growing alarm that Tyler was not just defending himself, but was actively challenging Connor's entire approach to social leadership at Riverside High. Tyler's words were carefully chosen to highlight the contrast between Connor's intimidation-based authority and Tyler's achievement-based respect, and the students listening clearly understood the implications. Ryan Torres attempted to support Connor by stepping forward aggressively, but Tyler's response was immediate and decisive. Tyler didn't back away or show any sign of intimidation. Instead, Tyler simply looked directly at Ryan with the kind of steady confidence that made Ryan's aggressive posture appear childish and unnecessary. "Ryan," Tyler said quietly, "I don't think either of us needs to prove anything here. We're all just students trying to get through high school successfully." Tyler's calm response to Ryan's aggressive posture demonstrated exactly the kind of mature leadership that made Connor's methods appear crude and outdated. Tyler had diffused a potential confrontation while maintaining his dignity and making Ryan look foolish for attempting to escalate a conversation that Tyler was conducting with perfect civility. Connor felt his authority slipping away as he watched students respond to Tyler's demonstration of how to handle conflict with intelligence rather than aggression. Several underclassmen who had previously sought Connor's approval were now looking at Tyler with obvious admiration, clearly preferring Tyler's approach to leadership over Connor's reliance on intimidation. "Well," Connor said finally, recognizing that continuing the conversation would only further expose his disadvantage, "I'm sure we'll all benefit from your example, Tyler." Tyler nodded graciously, accepting Connor's retreat with the kind of magnanimous dignity that made Connor's concession appear inevitable rather than surprising. "I hope so, Connor. I think Riverside High has room for all kinds of success stories." As Connor walked away with Ryan and Marcus, he could hear Tyler resuming his conversation about mathematics with Emma and the other students who had sought his help. Tyler's transition back to academic discussion was seamless and natural, demonstrating that his confrontation with Connor had been just one small part of Tyler's day, rather than the defining moment Connor had hoped it would be. Connor spent the rest of the morning observing how completely Tyler's emergence had changed the social dynamics at Riverside High. Students who had previously competed for Connor's attention were now seeking opportunities to associate with Tyler. Teachers who had deferred to Connor's preferences were now consulting with Tyler about academic and extracurricular opportunities. Most significantly, several other students who had been targets of Connor's harassment were now approaching Tyler for advice and support, clearly recognizing him as someone who understood their situation and had successfully overcome it. The transformation reached its climax during lunch, when Tyler was approached by Coach Anderson with an offer to join the wrestling team as captain for the remainder of the season. Tyler's acceptance was met with enthusiastic applause from the students gathered in the cafeteria, and Connor watched with growing dismay as Tyler was surrounded by teammates, supporters, and college recruitment representatives who wanted to discuss his athletic and academic future. Connor found himself sitting alone with Ryan and Marcus, isolated from the celebration surrounding Tyler's appointment as wrestling captain. For the first time in his high school career, Connor was experiencing what it felt like to be irrelevant to the social dynamics of Riverside High. Tyler's emergence had not just challenged Connor's authority. Tyler had demonstrated an entirely different model of leadership based on achievement, humility, and genuine service to others. Emma Rodriguez approached Connor's table with her camera, clearly intending to document this moment for the school newspaper. "Connor," she said with professional courtesy that somehow felt more insulting than open hostility, "would you like to comment on Tyler's appointment as wrestling captain?" Connor recognized Emma's question as an opportunity to demonstrate graciousness in defeat and perhaps salvage some dignity from the complete collapse of his social dominance. "Tyler has clearly earned the respect of his teammates and the wrestling community," Connor said carefully. "I'm sure he'll do an excellent job representing Riverside High." Emma nodded and made notes, but Connor could see in her expression that she understood exactly what his diplomatic response really meant. Connor Blake, the former undisputed king of Riverside High, was publicly acknowledging Tyler Matthews as his superior in the only currency that really mattered, the genuine respect of their peers. As Connor watched Tyler accept congratulations from students, teachers, and community members throughout the lunch period, he began to understand that his campaign of harassment had not just failed, but had actively contributed to Tyler's eventual triumph. Connor's pressure had forced Tyler to abandon his strategy of concealment and reveal capabilities that established him as the most impressive student at Riverside High. Connor's intimidation had given Tyler the opportunity to demonstrate grace under pressure and strength of character that made Connor's own leadership style appear petty and destructive. Connor Blake had set out to prove that Tyler Matthews was weak and unworthy of respect. Instead, Connor had created the circumstances that allowed Tyler to prove he was stronger, more capable, and more deserving of leadership than Connor had ever been. The quiet transfer student who had spent weeks crawling on his knees to avoid confrontation had emerged as a champion who commanded respect through achievement rather than fear. Tyler Matthews was no longer hiding who he was, and Connor Blake was learning that sometimes the biggest mistake a bully can make is forcing their victim to stop being afraid. 6 months later, Tyler Matthews stood at the center of Riverside High's gymnasium, wearing his varsity letter jacket and holding the trophy that marked his victory at the state wrestling championship. The same gym where Connor Blake had forced him to make the most difficult decision of his high school career was now filled with community members, college representatives, and local media celebrating Tyler's achievement as the first state champion in Riverside High wrestling history. Emma Rodriguez, now serving as editor of the school newspaper, approached Tyler with her camera and notebook, ready to conduct the interview that would close the story she had been following since Tyler's first day at the school. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.